Hello, I'm Lois Lee. I'm the founder and the executive director of Children of the Night. I'm really sorry that I could not be with you today, but I'm involved in a police investigation that requires me to stay in Los Angeles, and I really had intended to be there, and I wanted to spend time to talk to you about my work and to talk to you about any questions you may have about my work. I think the most important thing I can tell you today is how these kids get involved in prostitution. 80% of the kids that I work with have a history of being sexually abused. They are incest victims. They've been sexually abused in the home. In addition, these kids are white, middle-class kids. Most of the kids have also been institutionalized in adolescent psychiatric facilities. Most of these kids, in fact, are middle-class kids. Their parents, through their jobs or their employment, are able to place their children when there's a problem in the home in these adolescent facilities to treat the children and hopefully return them to home. Oftentimes, these facilities are used as dumping grounds, a place to put their kids so that they don't have to deal with them. Sometimes the kids return home, sometimes the kids run actually from the institutions in which they're placed. The kids that are not sexually abused are physically abused. They're beaten. Some of them have been whipped. Some of them have actually been shot by their parents. And the ones that don't meet either one of those qualifications have actually been abandoned by their parents. I've seen kids who have been on the road with their parents, and the parents stop at a gas station. The kids go to the bathroom, they come out, and their parents are gone. Kids come home from school, and the parents have picked up and have moved on them. Most commonly, when the kids are sexually abused, the father, and fathers are most common, stepfathers second, and thirdly are mom's boyfriends, are under the influence of alcohol. We hear a little bit of parents being under the influence of drugs, but most commonly the father is under the influence of alcohol. The kids are actually socialized into prostitution. The sexual training goes on in the home, and oftentimes these kids are rewarded for their sexual favors that they're providing to their parents. In many instances, the children that are on the streets tend to be older children. These kids at ages 10, 11, 12, sometimes 13, often find the situation at home intolerable. They run away and they hit the streets. When they're found on the streets and asked, how do you feel about doing this kind of behavior, prostitution in particular, they often say, I would rather be on the streets doing it with strangers than to return home, lay in my bed at night, and wait for my dad, my stepdad, or my mom's boyfriend to come into my bedroom. Obviously, we have child abuse hotlines, and we're in this whole time now where child abuse is supposed to be a focal point of problems that we're dealing with children of today. However, these kids, for some reason, and many of the reasons I believe are related to their middle-class status, are a result of pediatricians, teachers, and other professionals not picking up the child abuse. Police officers, when they're called into homes because of family disruption, are much more reluctant to pull children from middle-class homes than they are from the minority communities or the poorer homes. The two sociological theories that best explain entry into prostitution is differential association and differential opportunity. Anyone can enter prostitution if one is exposed to prostitution and two is susceptible to prostitution. Runaways with a history of sexual abuse particularly are susceptible and easy prey to pimps and pornographers. When they first hit the streets, they may find other kids where kids will offer them a place to stay. There are an enormous amount of people on the streets in your major urban areas that are on fixed income, that live on the streets, that will oftentimes let runaways stay with them. And the kids will have to take turns in terms of who provides the sex. In addition, it's important to understand that when children run away in this country, it's very predictable of where they run to. They run to the nearest urban area. Kids on the West Coast or the western region of the United States tend to run through Hollywood, or at least pass through Hollywood at one point in their runaway career. Kids from Louisiana go to the French Quarter. Kids from parts of the Midwest will often run to New York City. When they're offered a place to stay, the sexual learning or the sexual training of prostitution is again reinforced. Oftentimes, they will find a sophisticated pimp who will offer them a place to stay, and he may tell them that they have a girlfriend, and the girls will think, well, I can go stay there because he has a girlfriend, he won't harass me sexually. But soon she learns that she's going to be introduced to prostitution. Some kids are kidnapped by lower class pimps, or what are known as catchers, who are on the streets, who are not necessarily professional pimps. These guys tend to be very, very violent. They'll abduct a child, they'll throw a child in the back of a motel room. They'll charge usually illegal immigrants $15 for 15 minutes to do whatever they like. After a few days, sometimes after a week, this lower class pimp will sell the child behind her back to a more sophisticated pimp, who will stage an event where he'll walk into the motel room, kick in the door, tell her that she should never be treated this way, that he's going to take care of her, and that he's going to show her how to make it in society, and that the two of them can make a lot of money. And he becomes her hero. He becomes her rescuer. Some kids are just outright conned by pimps. One of the techniques that pimps use is by manipulating cognitive dissonance. They will tell a child that all society wants from you is sex. They've found this to be true with their home situations. They've found this to be true when they've hit the streets, that no one's willing to offer them a legitimate job. They're not families walking around on the streets looking for that poor young stray that they can take into their house and put her through school or put him through school and help them make it in society. They find people who are willing to pay them for sex. And the younger they are, the better they are. The other technique that pimps will use, and there are many, is a crisscross technique. He may find two young girls, one being less attractive, less bright than the other. And he will go after the one who's less attractive, the one who's not used to receiving all of the attention. And he will highlight her characteristics. He will tell her that you're more beautiful than your friend. You are smarter than your friend. You have more soul than your friend. And he does this because he knows that he can encourage the woman who is used to getting these compliments to compete in terms of his expectations. And sure enough, he's able to coerce them both into prostitution and to get them to compete in terms of his expectations. Another strategy that is not regularly used, but it's yet not that uncommon, is something known as staged performances. In some situations, a pimp may abduct a child, try and get a child to prostitute, and she will not prostitute under any circumstances. Yet she may not have as strong feelings against stealing. So a pimp will say to her, look, I'm going to give you this pill. I want you to go meet this man, and when this man has his drink, you slip the pill in his drink, and when he passes out, you take his pants and his wallet, and you run to me. And she says, okay, I can do that. In exchange for that, he promises to let her go. She goes through with the routine. She gives him the pill. The man passes out. Except shortly after, 2 or 3, sometimes 4 accomplices of the pimps will show up with a stretcher, put the man on the stretcher, cover his body with a sheet, and the pimp will tell the young lady, you fool, look, now you've killed him. And I'm going to have to pay the police $20,000 to get you out of prostitution. So if you don't do what I say in order to pay me back, I'm going to have to turn you into the police right now. It's a very, very effective technique. A few years ago, I was called into the Hollywood police station where the police had asked me to talk to a young lady, a 14-year-old girl who refused to sign a crime complaint against the pimp. They had the pimp, they had most of the evidence, but they needed a victim. She had to sign the crime complaint. And so when I went into the station, I took the young lady into a private room, and I did basically to her what a pimp does to her. I showed her my omnipotence, my knowledge of the streets. I moved her around the room and told her to put her back to a wall so that the police could not hear. And I asked her, why won't you sign this crime complaint? She said, I can't. I said, why? Did you kill somebody? And she said, how do you know? I said, don't worry about it. I can take care of that too. I just want you to sign this crime complaint and I'll walk you out of here now. To this day, I have never been able to convince her that she has not killed somebody, that this, in fact, was a game that a pimp had played upon her in order to get her to prostitute for him for a 3-year period. Many children on the streets who have been with pimps believe that in their past that they have actually killed someone, and they use that as a justification for their involvement in prostitution. Another technique of pimps is pimps will sometimes wine and dine and take a young lady out and buy her clothes and then tell her that the money that he has spent on her has come from his money that he's earned from selling drugs, and that he has had some drugs stolen from him and that the mafia is now going to kill him. And if he cares anything at all about her, or she cares anything at all about him, that she will help him. And he presents prostitution as a temporary solution to a problem. It's a very, very common strategy that's used day in and day out on the streets. Another strategy is one of blackmail. They may give a young lady drugs to lower their inhibitions, take nude pictures of them, and threaten to take them back to their high school and show their friends what they really are. Oftentimes, when pimps first meet kids, they perform something they call a deep quiz. They may say, why don't you have your father buy you this car? Why don't you have your father buy you this dress? And kids tend to be their own worst enemies. We need to educate kids not to tell people about their personal lives or about their families. Because most often kids will say, well, I don't get along with my dad, or my parents don't like me, or my dad's an alcoholic. And this actually tells the pimp or the pornographer, even the child molester, of what game and what strategy to use in order to exploit the child. It is by far the most common. When parents are contacted, they tell us that these kids can't come home. Sometimes they will say, well, she or he does not get along with my new husband. I can't handle her problems. I've used up all of my insurance to have her treated. Sometimes a mother will say, I know this sounds terrible, but she can't come home because she's taken my husband away from me because of the sexual abuse. 3 common characteristics of children involved in prostitution: the history of the abusive home, early institutionalization, and a lack of connectedness with anyone in the family. These kids have never felt like they've belonged to the family, or that they've been part of the family, or that they're connected to any individual in their family. That's what the pimp provides. Now, a very important thing to understand about prostitution and the pimp-prostitute relationship is that most of the prostitutes are representative of the main ethnic dominant group in society. Most of the children prostitutes I work with are white. 80% of these kids are white middle-class kids. Only 10% are black, and the other 10% are mixed. The pimps represent the minority groups of our community, or of our society. This has been true throughout history. Pimps in London tend to be Arab. During the Depression, pimps tended to be Jewish. Today, many street pimps are black. And that's an important characteristic to recognize because of the fact that the child who is white, who's been sexually abused by her white father, who has hit the streets and had white men continually sexually exploit her and offer to pay her for sex. Remember now that 75% of the men who pay for sex in this society are white men. That when she hooks up with a minority member who can separate himself from the identification of being the abuser, and oftentimes pimps do not have sex with their girls to keep that separation in order to keep control, and he can say, baby, I'm going to show you you already know what everybody in society wants from you. You know what these people want. It's you and me against the world, and I'm going to show you how to get their money. And then I'm going to buy you a house, and we're going to live in the hills, and you're going to have my baby. Boy prostitutes are somewhat different than girl prostitutes. Boy prostitutes most often do not have pimps. However, in the last few years, we have seen an extreme move of organized prostitution here on the West Coast. We know that there are houses of prostitution, but many of the men who sell the boy prostitutes, rather than being pimps, tend to be more like madams. The boys, too, have been sexually abused in the home, sometimes by a relative, more often by a neighbor, camp director, someone from a church organization, usually someone close to the family. Early identification of homosexuality. These kids knew that they were gay when they were 3, 4, 5 years old. Some of the kids who are not homosexual, who just run away from troubled homes, will hit the streets and sleep in the condemned buildings and hitchhike across country, and they think that they can handle it. But what they don't realize is that shortly they may be gang raped by 4 or 5 guys and sodomized. And after an experience like that, it serves as an institution for these children is a passive acceptance of a social reality. Without intervention in the lives of these children, they will enter more serious kinds of crimes. Most commonly, the girls will move into forgery and fraud. and fraudulent credit card rings, which pimps also control. Pimps operate underground schools where they put their girls together and have experts come in and train them how to pass bad checks, how to pass bad credit cards, and how to steal them. Boys, more often, will go into burglary and violent kinds of crimes, sometimes actually homicide. Oftentimes when the boys are involved in prostitution, they may agree to perform certain kinds of sex, but they're not willing to participate in all kinds of sex. Most commonly, they'll participate in oral sex. But oftentimes, customers will pick them up, take them home, handcuff them, and sodomize them. And we've seen an increase among these children of turning around and acting the violence out upon the customer by actually stabbing him, sometimes killing him. We also, with the boys, see a lot of customers picking up the boys and giving them drugs before they perform sex on them. And sometimes the boys are dying from that. Sometimes the customers will call our hotline, and they're unwilling to call the police number or the 911 number. So as our procedures, we've had them take the body down to a payphone, call 911, and hide and watch the body while the paramedics arrive. Some of these kids will actually kill themselves. Some of these kids will be killed by dangerous customers. Some of these kids are going to die from AIDS. We've only had a few kids die from AIDS, and most of these kids do not want to be tested for AIDS because they're very fatalistic anyway. If you say to them, "Don't you realize that you can die from AIDS?" they'll say, "Don't you realize I can die with the next customer that I have tonight?" And many of these kids, most of these kids, are going to have drug or alcohol problems. The drugs and the alcohol come into play not usually prior to leaving home, but once they're on the streets and they've entered prostitution. They need the drugs and the alcohol in order to cope with the behavior that's involved in prostitution. And contrary to what most people think, pimps do not give the kids drugs because pimps are very costly. And then the drug becomes the pimp, and the pimp can actually lose control unless he himself is a drug addict. The drugs and the alcohol come from the customers. Again, the mainstream of society. The effects of prostitution, in addition to that, is there is an extreme estrangement from the mainstream of society. We must remember that the people who pay these children for sex are laborers, truck drivers, salesmen, preachers, rabbis, movie stars, producers, cops, and of all the professions, the most common profession are attorneys who patronize these children. So these kids have a very strong sense of in-group and out-group identity. And because of the situation with prostitution, and it is the mainstream who is actually paying them for the sexual behavior, it is doubtful that they will ever be trusting of society again. These kids, I want to repeat, have a very strong sense of in-group and out-group identity, and they will never, in most cases, see themselves as part of the mainstream of society. They are very, very manipulative. They find it very difficult to relate in ways that are not sexual. They're often unable to deal with or tolerate white males because, again, they represent the customers of their business. Many of the girls will end up going on welfare once they become pregnant and they retire in the minority communities. The treatment of teenage prostitution or of any troubled children in general has really been dominated by psychologists and social workers. For the teenage prostitute, psychologists have again and again and again been real unable to deal with these kids. It's been tremendously ineffective, primarily because the nature of the psychological counseling involves getting into issues of talking in depth about how you feel about things. Well, there's a lot more discussion and sexual fantasy and talking going on in prostitution than what most people realize. And because of the nature of the psychological counseling, the psychologist immediately becomes identified by the child as a trick. This is a voyeur. This is someone who wants to hear about all of the details. And so the child takes control of the situation. Children of the Night provides crisis intervention to these children, and we maintain a list of private therapists in the community who will give us free space on their caseload so that children can have individual therapy outside of the Children of the Night organization for free. But oftentimes these volunteers quit in frustration because the kids may come once and they constantly cancel appointments. And when the kids do get into these situations, they often use the psychologist as a way to manipulate other services out of Children of the Night. They want to talk about a Children of the Night staff person. They don't want to talk about their experiences on the streets, and they don't want to talk about their moms and their dads, because oftentimes that's still too painful. Social workers tend to pick up these kids, place them in institutions, and they also tend to be very, very punitive. We find that kids are oftentimes sitting in institutions far too long merely because a social worker is angry with them. Oftentimes social workers do inappropriate placements. Oftentimes when they're placing these kids, that's the end of the road. They don't continue to deal with these kids through the system, and we consider that dumping. Children of the Night was specifically designed to work with kids involved in prostitution or pornography. These kids need a tremendous amount of attention and a tremendous amount of support. Group settings do not work in terms of trying to deal with their problems. Everything must be done on an individual basis, and you must ensure confidentiality. We have 3 programs in the Children of the Night program, one being the 24-hour hotline. If a child calls the hotline, we keep the child on the phone while a taxi cab, which we pay for, is sent to pick that child up and take them to a safe location. Once the hotline volunteer has completed placing that child for the evening, the hotline volunteer is required to call into the intake center and leave a detailed message of the case that they specifically dealt with. In the morning, the intake center staff picks up those messages and calls the child and talks to the child to make sure that the placement was appropriate, to see if there's any more services we can provide for that child, and in most cases there are. In the intake center, we provide kids with birth certificates on first contact. Once the birth certificate comes in, we apply for a picture identification. Once the picture IDs come in and the birth certificate, we're able to get the child a Social Security card. All of our efforts at Children of the Night are geared towards attempts to mainstream these children in the larger part of society. We provide resumes for the children. We help them develop a job history. We do job development. We place them in schools, and we also place them in jobs. We rescue kids directly from pimps, sometimes using the police and sometimes using civilians. We also place kids in drug programs. We're one of the only agencies in Southern California that I am aware that allow kids to come into the intake center under the influence of drugs. Our procedures for doing such is that we call the paramedics and get specific instructions from the paramedics of how to treat the children. And of course, if the children are in real danger, they're immediately taken to the hospital by the paramedics. In most cases, that's not necessary. We often wrap them in sheets and give them pillows and let them sleep on the floor until we can get a drug program ready for them. If the children are from out of state, we arrange direct flight plane tickets and have a drug intervention officer and a parent pick them up on the other end, because parents cannot deal with this problem on their own. Many of our kids do need to go into drug programs, and that's why it's even more important that on first contact we obtain a birth certificate, second contact a picture identification, and then a Social Security card so that we can obtain funds to place them in drug programs. Everything at Children of the Night is geared at staying 2 steps ahead of the children. No one is sold on the issue of trying to get out of prostitution. No value judgments are made whatsoever. But we know that these kids are going to bottom out soon, and it's our job to have the paperwork ready and to be there willing to assist to help them get off the streets. Our third program is a street program where we go into 5 different counties and work with the kids on the streets. We put stickers in payphones that say, "Tired of turning tricks, pimps don't care, we do, call day or night." We give kids plastic cards of telling them our services on one side and a list of local agencies on the other side. In the last 2 years, we have watched the prostitution population and the prostitution circuit change. Pimps have moved out of the major cities. They run a circuit from Tacoma, Washington, Spokane, Washington, into Portland, Oregon, skipping San Francisco altogether, going into Seaside, Monterey, Salinas, skipping Hollywood altogether, going directly into Orange County on Harbor Boulevard, just a few blocks from Disneyland, and then moving to Chula Vista. And those who have made money go off to Hawaii and then to Alaska and complete the circuit. It's very similar to the new circuit that is run by gang members and also run by the drug circuit. And we have found gang members starting to move into pimping. This trend is very, very important in our efforts to work with the kids on the street. Children of the Night is funded strictly by the private sector, so when the kids move or the pimps move the kids, we are able, with our funding, to be able to pick up and move with them and move our street program to where we actually operate a mobile outreach van in the areas where the pimps are working child prostitutes. Also in the outreach team, it gives us an opportunity to work with the kids in their own natural environment without making value judgments and being able to show them, to demonstrate to them that we understand the prostitution environment, we understand the prostitution subculture, we're not afraid of it, and we're not passing value judgments on it. Once a child is in the Children of the Night program, and you're in the Children of the Night program the minute you call the hotline or the minute you come into the intake center or are contacted on the streets, you are never requested to do anything on your own. If you are required to have meetings with the police, it is done. We are there with you. If you go to juvenile hall, we go down to juvenile hall for all of your visitation. If you have to go to court, we go with you. If you go out to apply for a job, we go with you. We are there with these kids every single step of the way. If you're kicked out of a shelter, oftentimes we will place you in a motel and allocate staff to spend time with you on weekends and in the evenings. The most valuable lessons I think that I've learned in sociology that have helped me with my work, the one most valuable that I think is beyond the others, is to be value-free in my work with these kids, not to impose my values upon them. Now, you learn that mostly in research and in your research techniques. However, it's also something that's very applicable in terms of actually working and using your sociology in the field. I have found that that has been the most valuable. It is the most difficult characteristic to transfer to staff and volunteers. Many people are capable of doing it, but many people are not. And we find that oftentimes that is the one reason that we are terminating staff or volunteers from the program. My understanding of subcultures, their roles, the rules, the do's and don'ts have been of tremendous value, particularly in working with pimps. I'm required by the nature of what I do sometimes to intermingle with pimps on the street, to talk to pimps on the street. I have a very friendly, casual relationship with them. I've never been threatened by the pimps. In fact, by the time that one of their girls has come to me, they move away. They don't want anything to do with her because they know I've already involved the police. And one of the games I enjoy playing with the pimps is going into the pimp bars when a particular pimp is threatening one of our kids, and just going into the pimp bars and start asking about him. And where's JoJo? What's JoJo doing? Where's JoJo? Because I know someone's going to run to the back phone and call JoJo and say, she's asking about you out here. And what happens to JoJo is that none of the other pimps are going to deal him any drugs for a few weeks. None of the pimps are going to fence him any hot clothes. No one's going to have anything to do with him because they're afraid he has heat. The rule within the pimp subculture, within the prostitution subculture, is that you never mention a pimp's name. You never talk about a pimp's business. There's a very rigid set of do's and don'ts that I don't have time to go into with you now, but I have written on this, and if you would like the information on the pimp subculture and the typology of pimping strategies, I'd be happy to send it to you. Differential association and differential opportunity are very valuable theories, I think, in terms of understanding the involvement and how these kids become involved in prostitution, because obviously all incest victims do not become prostitutes. The solutions to prostitution: I'm for decriminalization, but I say that with some hesitation. I strongly oppose legalization. The legalization system does not allow a prostitute to be part of the society. Women are locked up. They're required to work 14, 17-day shifts. There's medical testing done on them. To me, it's very much of a prison situation. I would like to see prostitutes to be able to go to work, and after they're done with work, to be able to go home and take care of their families just like anyone else. The professional prostitutes who are now referring to themselves as sex workers, I understand, have said I'm unsympathetic to their cause. I'm not unsympathetic to their cause. In fact, my first work involved suing the police department for not arresting an equal number of Johns. And I knew that if I could ensure that an equal number of customers were arrested and suffered the consequences that women suffer as prostitutes for being arrested for prostitution, that I could ensure a change in legislation. What I do find in disagreement with the sex workers is that I do believe that the groundwork and the rules and the regulatory procedures have to be laid down before they hit so hard on the publicity, because I am concerned that the publicity is changing public opinion, which I think is good. However, without them setting up the regulations and the procedures, they're opening it up to professional pimps who will come in and organized crime who will come in and set it up for them, and they too will find themselves working in prison-like environments. I think that this task should be taken on by academics. I think that sociologists should have a major role in it. I think that sociologists should be working with the sex workers. I think the health department, people in the health field need to be involved, as well as city planners. Every time I talk to the sex workers about that, they ask me if I can do it. It's something that I would love to do, but I just cannot find the time to do it. You as sociologists are capable of doing this. You have the skills, you have the training, and I think that you have the empathy in order to work with them. Public support. Children of the Night only takes private money. Our contributors range from people that are very famous to people that aren't so famous. We have a lot of people that will send us $15 a month to $25 a month. Some of them they have been victims of sexual abuse. Some of them are just parents. Many of them are religious. As far as legislative support, I worked with Senator Roberti a few years ago to put together a mandatory sentencing law on pimps so that pimps would have to go to jail for 3 years, because judges were very reluctant to put them in jail because they did not have any prior criminal convictions. I think that what needs to be done legislatively and what's happened in this country is that we have decriminalized the runaway law. We have taken away the power from the police to pick up kids on the street and place them somewhere. Prior to 1976 in California and in many other states, police were allowed to pick up these kids and place them in juvenile hall. I don't think juvenile hall is the answer, but I do think that the police should have the power, because that would solve the entire outreach problem throughout the country, and there needs to be a safe place for these kids to go. I don't believe the psychological counseling and all the money we're spending on therapy is the answer. I think these kids need to live in schools, something very similar to boarding schools that need to be affordable for their parents and affordable to the taxpayer. Something more like boarding schools where they're in the same program from the beginning to the end, rather than being shifted from one foster home to another foster home. That's our plans for the Children of the Night shelter, which will open in February of 1990. It's very similar to a boarding school, and it's geared towards helping kids get jobs and helping them obtain their first apartments and furnishing those apartments for them. I'm running out of time and I have to go. However, I'm very sorry I couldn't entertain your questions, and if you would like to write your questions to me, I promise you that I will answer them. Please write to Children of the Night, Post Office Box 4343, Hollywood, California 90078. Thank you.